One thing I've learned in my life, I've learned a lot of things. I know I've only lived like 27 years, but to me, it's a long time. It's all my life. It's a while. And something I've learned is that God oftentimes works in connections. Anybody else figure that out? Like God connects you with people, He connects you with places, and He works in connections. And whenever I was little, I was in a play called Joy Story, not Toy Story, Joy Story. And there was a song that was called The Scarlet Thread. And it said that there is a scarlet thread that weaves its way through the ages, that weaves a tapestry of hope. And as you read the pages of Scripture, the truth unfolds about the scarlet thread that draws a line and connects God to you and me. And that scarlet thread binds us together eternally. And as we've been journeying through Matthew chapter 1, we started it last week, we're going to be going through this little scarlet thread that goes all the way back to Abraham and makes its way to who? Anybody remember? Jesus. That's always a good church answer. If you don't know, answer Jesus, right? So Jesus, it gets its way all the way from Abraham to Jesus, and we're making stops along this route through the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. And today we're going to have a surprise stop. A surprise stop on this connection. And the reason I say it's a surprise stop is because it's this person that most people would not have thought, especially the early readers of the New Testament who are reading the genealogy of Jesus, they would be like, what? Wait, you mean that person is in Jesus' family tree? For real? Like there are so many other people that God could have connected to Jesus. Why this person? So we're going to check it out. I'm somebody who likes to travel. Most of you know that about me. I love to go on trips. And one thing I really like are surprise stops. And one surprise stop that really got me one time, it's not what you think. It wasn't on necessarily a road trip. It was, but it was after I got there. And it was me and one of my best friends, Shanna. We were kayaking in the Tetons, okay? Now, in the Tetons, there are a lot of glacial lakes, and they're smaller, so you have to kind of portage between them, which a portage is just a connection that you have to carry your boat across to the other lake. And so we had traveled and already made our way to another lake, and it was getting dark. Now, I tell all these stories, and y'all are going to think I'm a terrible traveler or hiker. I'm really not. Y'all just hear the really funny ones, okay? I'm really not that bad or forgetful or unprepared. But this particular time, we had gotten over to a lake called Lee Lake, and it was very large, and we were kayaking through, and I realized that I had brought my kayaking backpack, but I didn't put anything in it. I didn't have bear spray. I didn't have my gun. I had nothing. I had a rope and like flip-flops, and I was not ready to hog tie a bear and beat it to submission with flip-flops. That was not my plan. And so when I realized that it was getting dark, I started getting this feeling inside of me like this is not a good place to be. And just a side note, that when oftentimes in life when you have that feeling of this isn't the way I should be going, or I should turn around and get back to maybe the plan that God had for me, or this maybe isn't the place I need to be, that's not just your digestion. That is probably the Holy Spirit working inside of you, because Scripture says that when the Holy Spirit, when the truth comes, then He will guide you in the way of truth and righteousness. And so that's Him working inside of you. And I can imagine that David, whenever he was standing on the roof looking at Bathsheba, he probably had a moment where he was like, oh, I should probably not do this. I bet the Spirit was working in him, but he decided to go anyway. I bet Samson, when he was laying on Delilah's lap, probably had a moment where he was like, oh, I shouldn't do this. But he did it anyway. And so those moments when you have that feeling, it's best to turn around. That's the moral of the story. And so I did what I always do and kept going. And we got a little bit further, and finally we decided to turn around. And it was getting pretty dark, and I had no way of protecting us from anything, and the handle on my kayak broke. So we were taking two kayaks, one of them that was half broken, across back to the other side, through woods, up and down hills, as it's getting dark. and we probably smell like fish. So this is not a good scenario. And so we're going, and the person who was holding the part of the kayak that the handle had broke on had to walk backwards. It was the most comfortable way to carry and just the most efficient. So that was me, because I broke it. And so I was walking backwards and carrying the kayak, and she was walking forward. And all of a sudden, we had a surprise stop. And she stops in the trail. Now me, not being able to see anything, my heart starts racing a little fast. And I turn around. I don't want to drop the kayaks, because if it is a bear, you want to try to be calm, not freak out. It's harder than it sounds. Maybe not. And so I was standing there, and I was like, what? Why did you stop? And she said, there's something in the trail. It's not a lot of information when you're nervous. So I said, what's in the trail? She said, there's something in the trail. I said, okay, what is in the trail? And I was freaking out. I was like, oh my goodness, is this a bear? She will just run, but the thought went through my head, she's closer to it. So I could just drop the kayaks and run, get in the water. That's not a good idea, by the way. Bears can swim pretty fast, too. And so all these thoughts went through my head, and I'm a terrible friend. So I thought I can just run, even though everybody and their mother can run faster than me. Ask Shayna. And so I thought through this scenario, and I said, what in the world is on the trail? And she finally said, it's a deer. A deer. Shanna, we live in Kentucky. We see deer all the time. You're more likely to hit a deer than you are to hit a dog, like in the road. It's just, you see deer all the time. Why are you stopping to see a deer? And she said, I just thought it was neat. And if you know her, she's got a real thick country accent. And I just wanted to slap that country accent right out of her, because it scared me to death. And she said, it's a deer. And so later, when we had this conversation about the surprise stop, I said, why did you stop and look at a deer? What was it about it? And she said, well, I know I've seen a lot of them before, but it was just unique. Where it was unique. There was something different about it in the creation that it was in and the place it was at. Even though it was familiar, I saw something beautiful in it. In this story today, this connection on our way to Jesus throughout the genealogy may be familiar to you. But I hope today you can look at it and find something unique, that you can look at it and find something special as we look at this story today of a woman named Rehab in Joshua chapter 2. So we start out here in Joshua chapter 2. Now Joshua has taken over for Moses at this point. Moses was the leader of the Israelites for a while. And Joshua had taken over, and it says that, and Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men. Now, stop right there just real quick. 2 men, not 12. Moses, about 10 decades or 4 decades earlier, had sent 12 men. Just so you know, you don't need a ton of opinions in your life when you're trying to figure out what God is trying to do in your life. So he just sent 2, because when Moses sent 12, 10 came back and were scared to death and said, hey, we shouldn't do it. And 2 said, no, we should go ahead. But Moses didn't do it because the 10 said no and the 2 said yes. So Joshua learned, and he only sent 2. He sent 2 men secretly from Shittim. That's a long I. If you tell anybody about the sermon later, make sure you pronounce it right. Shittim, as spies. And saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute. A prostitute whose name was Rehab, and lodged there. Now think about this. Why did they go to the house of a prostitute? Why? I mean, was like the Choice Hotel booked? What happened when they went into the city? And some theologians say, well, they went into the house of the prostitute because it was the place, if you were a foreigner in the land, it was an unsuspicious place for you to go. We don't know that for sure. It could have been it. They could have been walking down the street and God could have said, hey, go into that place. And they were probably like, no, that place? Or they could have been like, hey, we're out of the camp. Let's go to the prostitute's house. We don't really know. It's kind of left for us to wonder. But what I do know is that no matter how they got to the house of the prostitute, God arranged it and used it. Whether he actually arranged it or he allowed them to get there, God still used it. So even in your mess, even in your bad mistakes, God still weaves a thread through those to paint it and to kind of make the tapestry look like him and not your bad decisions if you lend your will and your way to him, even after you make stupid, bad decisions. So they ended up at this prostitute's house, Rehab. And they lodged there. And in verse 2 it said, and it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, the men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. This meant they probably weren't very good spies, because they got found out pretty quick once they got into the city. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rehab. So he sent soldiers over her way, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. Now, I once heard a preacher say when he was preaching on this passage, I just thought it was so funny. He said, you know that Rahab knew how to hide men. Because of her profession. She knew discretion. She knew what to do. And that goes to show me that even the stuff in our life that we would rather hide, that isn't good, even the skills she learned in her prostitution trade, God can still use to his glory later on. There's stuff in my life that I hated for people to find out, but they found out about it anyway, and I had to talk to them about it. But what happened is that God used those things that had happened in my life that I wasn't proud of or scared of or embarrassed of, and he used those to speak into other people's life and bring them freedom because of my once bondage that I had, but the freedom that he gave me through that, and my story became their testimony as well. And so oftentimes the problems and the struggles and the things we want to hide are actually things that God uses. How cool is that? Come on, church. Y'all got stuff you want to hide? I got to talk today. All right. So then and she said, so we got a prostitute, all right, who's already being used by God. And then she said, true. Everybody say true. True. Yeah, they were here. The men came to me, but I did not know where they went from here. And when the gate was about to be closed, gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. By the way, this is all a lie, so now we have a lying prostitute. All right. But she brought them up to the roof and hid them, and on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. So she sent the men out there, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers went. So now we have a lying prostitute that God uses to fulfill his purpose and bring about a promise that was given to the Israelites 40 plus years ago. How cool is that? God not only sticks her in here, but uses her. Before she was baptized, right? Before she went through any of the religious stuff or joined the church, he used her even in the midst of sitting in a whorehouse. And what I like to think is that in this moment, Rahab may have been sitting in her living room contemplating whether God was even real or not. Questioning, where are you, God? But he arranged it, and he made the connection that the spies went into the house where God found her in her living room. God doesn't just show up at church. He shows up in jail cells. He shows up in your house. He shows up in the back alleys, in the back streets, in the drug dens. He shows up everywhere, and we should not judge people who God shows up to, even though their story looks a little bit different. They can still be used, and they don't just have to be over some kind of rehab or something like that. They can be preachers and pastors. They can be gospel speakers because they are anointed and chosen, and God anointed and chose Rahab. God used a lying prostitute. By the way, back in the early 17th century, the Romans, who was it? The English church and Parliament. They would label people if they had committed adultery with a scarlet letter. And the message of today is, the title is the Scarlet Letter. And the reason I do that is because Rehab herself, I mean, she wasn't married, so she didn't commit adultery. But the truth is, we all have a scarlet letter. Did y'all realize that? Because our husband, our bridegroom is Christ, and we cheat on him all the time. Anytime we sin even a little bit, we cheat on Jesus Christ, and we commit adultery in a way. So your scarlet letter may look different. Her scarlet letter looked different. But the truth is, we can relate to Rahab today. We can find hope in this little pit stop, in this surprise stop with a lying prostitute, that Jesus looks at us, even with our scarlet letter, and says, there's still hope for you. The scarlet letter. So verse 8 says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she said to the men, I know. Look to your neighbor and say, I know. Don't spit in their face. We'll get in trouble. Say, I know that the Lord has given you the land. So she figured out that these spies were people of God, and she had heard stories. Listen to this. She had heard about God's reputation, and that the fear of you has fallen on us, and that all inhabitants of the land will melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord, your God, he is the God above the heavens and above the earth. Think about that. That Jesus came, right? And he was to be the King of Kings. But before even the Messiah came, they knew of the hope of God. Because God, over and over and over again, had proved faithful to the Israelites. And I think Rahab heard those stories, and instead of just melting with fear and saying, oh, we're defeated, bless our God, because he ain't big enough. Instead of doing that, she said, I want some of that. I want some of that. And God, in the midst of her wanting some of that, found her. And I think maybe some of us need to go home today and sit on our couch or our living room or even in our closet and say, God, I want some of that. I want some of that faithfulness, because I want to be faithful to you. See, Rahab was not just looking for the faithfulness that came from God. She was looking to be faithful to God. She risked her life sending those spies upstairs and hiding them. She risked immediate comfort for a hope that she didn't even know when it was going to come. She didn't know when the Israelites were going to come back and overtake Jericho. She didn't know when that was going to happen. But she knew that if she would have given up the spies, she may got a whole lot of money and not had to sell herself for sex. She may have been able to get out of the predicament she was in, send her family to nice schools, and her little cousins and her brothers and her sisters to nicer schools, and get a place out of the north side of the city, because it was the run-down part that nobody wanted to live in and the easy place to attack. She might have been able to get out of that spot, but instead of getting out of something right at the moment by giving into what the enemy wanted her to give into, she waited on the Lord and was faithful. Rehab. Now, she says in verse 12, now then, please swear to me by the Lord, that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house. And give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life is yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then the Lord, and when the Lord gives us the land, say when he does. It's not if he does, say when he does, because he's going to move. He's going to do something. It may not look like what you expected, but it's when, it's not if. When the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. So what happened after that is she sent them down the window outside of their house, and I'm not going to read all of this, but when they got down to the bottom, she says, so how am I going to know? And they give her a scarlet cord. A scarlet cord to tie on her window, the window that she let them out. Now, see, her house backed up to the wall, the back wall of the city. So they said, tie this scarlet cord around your window. And when we come back, we'll know which house we need to get you from. And make sure all of your family, make sure anybody who you want to be saved is in your house. Remember that the safest place is in the will of God, even when it's kind of scary. I imagine when the Jericho wall started tumbling down, it was probably pretty scary to be sitting there in that house. Even though it was in the midst of God's protection, it doesn't mean it's always easy. It doesn't mean it's always a place of peace even. It may be chaotic peace, but you're in the peace knowing that God, no matter what, is going to deliver you if he promised to deliver you. Even when it's scary, even when it sounds loud, even when you have a lot of voices and screams coming from all sides of you and things feel like they're crumbling apart all around you, God's hand is still upon you if you're in his will and you do what he's asked you to do. Now, I imagine that as the time went on between the time that the spies left and they came back, the Israelites came back and marched around Jericho, that she probably had people over at her house, and they might have saw the scarlet cord and said, well, what is that? What is that? So I just imagine that there were some times that she was very nervous in the waiting. And I imagine that for us, we can learn from Rehab that we may get very nervous in the waiting. When we're waiting for what God has for us next, or we're waiting for a promise to be fulfilled that he's given us, it can be nerve-wracking. It can be difficult when people don't really understand what that looks like or don't really understand what God is doing. It's difficult in the waiting, but God blesses it when you keep it to yourself sometimes, when you share it with your family. Remember, you don't want a ton of people's opinions when you're trying to discern what God is wanting you to do. And you're sitting there and you're like, you see the scarlet cord in the window. I just imagine her in her house and she's like, he's coming. They're coming for me. My salvation is coming. And we live in a time, we talk about this a lot here at the branch. We live in a time of in between. We're not in Eden, but we're not in the glorification process. We're not in glory yet. The final moment when all things are made new and there is a new heaven and a new earth. So we live in the waiting. And I imagine that sometimes we need to find some kind of scarlet cord to tie on our window, metaphorically in our brain, that's like, oh, God's coming. That even though this is a mess right now, he's gonna make it work out. Even though things are difficult right now, I don't really know what it's going to look like, and it may sound bad, and it may be a lot of chaos, but I know that he's in it. I know that he's working. So she tied the scarlet cord to her window. And later we find in Joshua chapter 6 that when they came and they marched around the walls and the walls came tumbling down. By the way, I looked this up because my biggest question was, well, like, did they drag them out of the rubble? What happened? And my Nana sat across the table from me. And, of course, I overthink things. I do a lot of escape rooms with Shayna, and we have a bad habit of overthinking absolutely everything and finding 10 ways to solve a puzzle that is very simple and a third grader could do. And so I was overthinking this, and I was thinking, okay, did God, like, do a bubble like on The Incredibles that the daughter does, and the rubble just come off? Like, what happened? And Nana said, well, that house probably just stood. He probably just didn't tear down her house. And I was like, that seems so simple. That just seems so easy. Like, he just cut it like a cake and the rest fell and that didn't. And so I looked it up because I'm also a curious person. And that's what people say happened, because in 1907 there was a study done in the archaeological site that they went to, and they studied this. They saw on the north end of town, where Rehab was said to live, there was still a remnants of the wall that you could see, and it looked like that there would have been a house on that outer wall, the place where Rahab probably lived. So it just makes me think as she's sitting there and she says, I heard what you did for the Israelites. I heard what your God did when he split the Red Sea. And I know it was scary when they were walking through because it was probably loud and they might have saw a shark swim past them or something. But I know it was scary, but I want to be part of that story. I know it may be scary, but I want to be part of it. And so she's sitting there in her house as the wall comes crumbling down all around her. And she says, I want to be part of the story. I want to be part of the story. I know it's scary, family, but let's be part of something bigger. And when we give ourselves to the scarlet thread that runs through the Bible, that connects us to God, we become part of something bigger. Because as an individual thread, we will ravel. And we will just float away eventually and unravel ourselves. But if we give ourselves to God, then he will weave us into a tapestry of his glory and his honor and his faith. So in verse 22 of chapter 6, it says, but the two men who had spied out the land said, go to the prostitute's house, which, by the way, was still standing. We already talked about that. And bring out the woman and all who belonged to her, as you swore to her. So the young men who had been spies brought out Rehab, and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. Now, a lot of times we may feel like outsiders in the house of God, especially when you first come to God. And I've dealt with stuff even in my life, being a Christian for a long time, that I felt like an outsider of God's house. And sometimes we go through stuff that we feel like an outsider of God's house, and they were put outside of the camp. But the neat thing is we're going to see that she marries someone from inside the camp who brings her into the family of the Israelites. And it wasn't just anybody, it was kind of a wealthier person inside the camp. And Jesus, by the way, died outside of the city so that you and I could be inside the family. That's exactly what happened, and we see that through the scarlet thread that runs through the ages, that he paints a picture in the Old Testament of what he did in the New Testament, and I love that Rahab. So Rahab, by the way, we met her as a prostitute, right? Everybody shake your head. Y'all stay with me. I promise we're getting there. We're at like the top of the roller coaster. We've been clicking. We're about to go down, and it's going to be fun. You ready? So Rahab, we met her as a prostitute. Now I want you to listen to this. It's very, very interesting. Follow with me. So Rahab, the prostitute, we met her in Joshua chapter 2. And in Joshua chapter 6, in Joshua's Braveheart speech, before they do their final march around the wall, he shouts this out. And I would imagine if Rahab was looking out her window, she would have been like rolling her eyes like, oh my gosh, what are you saying about me? Stop that. It says in verse 15, on the seventh day they rose early at the dawn of day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time, when the priest had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, so here's his big Braveheart speech, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, he could have stopped right there, but he continued, only Rahab the prostitute. I just imagine him like in this big, soldiers, get ready. Only Rahab the prostitute will be saved. And I imagine her hearing this like, man, you got to shout my business to everybody? Are you serious? What you doing? But the crazy thing is this name sticks with her. It's not just here. It's not just when we meet her. It's not just the people who met her then. It kind of sticks. Actually, in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, we find Rahab, the lying prostitute, next to David and all the crazy stuff that happened. In fact, in verse 29, it starts and says, by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, everybody say by faith. That's a key. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 times. By faith, the prostitute Rahab It stuck with her, even all the way to Hebrews in the Hall of Faith. It says under her picture when you walk down the hallway, Rahab the prostitute. I'm sure she doesn't like that very much. Rahab the prostitute, because she welcomed the spies and was not killed with those who were disobedient. But it goes on. You see, in James chapter 2, verse 25, it says, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous? Woo! Now that's a curveball. Wait a second. So now we have just the faithful Rahab, but now we have a righteous prostitute Rahab? Those things don't seem like they go together. Here's what I think that this is showing us. Is that God, and it brings us to the main point of my message. Rahab had a scarlet letter, just like you and I have a scarlet letter. She had a reputation that preceded her and she couldn't get rid of. She had a past that was hard to shake. Even through the writers and inspiration of the Bible, I imagine God saying, okay, write about Rahab in Hebrews. And the writer of Hebrews goes, oh, yeah, Rahab the prostitute. Because that's how he remembered her. And it followed her for a really long time. But here's what I think Rahab would say if she was sitting here with you and with me, is that she would say that God can take your scarlet letter and make you a redeemed image bearer. Because that's exactly what God did with Rahab. He took her scarlet letter, even though it followed her all the way through history in the Bible, and he made her a redeemed image bearer. And if he did it with her, I promise you, if he did it with me, he can do it with you. And he can do it with any person you meet on the street that you don't think is worthy. Any person on the street that you don't think can actually make it out of their situation. Any person on the street that you walk by and you think, man, they smell like straight up weed. That person, with a little bit of faith, because by faith, they too can have their scarlet letter turned into an image bearer mark on them in their lives. And not just an image bearer, but a redeemed image bearer. I imagine that, by the way, that Rahab's son is Boaz. If you know Boaz, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer of Ruth. And I imagine that Rahab's story had a big impact on Boaz. When they're sitting around the dinner table when Boaz was younger, and she shares of what she heard God do for the Israelites. As she shares not only that, but what God did for her. And what God continued to do for her and took her from the whorehouse to the Hall of Fame. And that when God took her from the lowest point in her life to being a person redeemed inside the camp of Israel. That she's sitting there telling her son, don't look at anybody like they can't be redeemed. Don't look at anybody like they can't be made new by God. Don't look at anybody like they don't deserve your kindness or your love. And then Boaz is out in the field one day listening to his mom's voice. I believe it might have trickled into his brain as he was looking out in the field, and he sees Rahab, somebody, a stranger from outside of the camp that he didn't recognize, or he sees Ruth. And he says, this may be a person I can show God's kindness to. That's somebody who's a redeemed image bearer. And he ends up sparking a conversation with her and becomes the kinsman redeemer. Those stories, it's so important that you continue to tell stories of God's faithfulness, not only from Scripture, but from your own life to your kids and your grandkids and their grandkids, if you have the ability to. Because when you are able to share the thread that is run so true in your life of God's work, then they will be affected. And maybe one day they will look at somebody and say, wait, what did my mama tell me? What was that my grandma told me about the time that God used her to go into a prison and speak to a lot of people? I think God may be calling me to do that. I think God may be calling me to go into prisons and preach to people. Or whenever God worked in a faithful way in your great-great-grandpa's life and led him to your great-great-grandmother, and that connection happened all because he was faithful to the calling that God had on his life to go to a new state or a new place and give his life to service to the kingdom. And that wouldn't have happened where he met his grandmother or your great-great-grandmother if that didn't happen. And so God works in those connections because of our faithfulness, and we need to share those experiences of God's faithfulness in our life to our kids and to our grandkids. So we've met Rehab the prostitute and Rehab the righteous prostitute. But I think the coolest verse about Rehab in the Bible is none of them that we've already read. Because what I imagine, I'm closing, I promise. Y'all don't get sleepy on me. What I imagine, so oftentimes when I read about somebody in the Bible and I'm envisioning what it would look like to talk to the characters, I promise I'm not crazy, I'm just on the edge. And so whenever I'm imagining these different characters in the Bible, oftentimes what I do is I imagine sitting around the campfire with them. Because that's just what I know. Now, I imagine someday in heaven, I'll sit around the campfire with different people from the Bible and get to talk to them about the glory that they had seen or different things that they did with Jesus or how God moved in their life. And I imagine sitting around the campfire with Rehab. And how I picture it is it's Grandma Rehab. You know, it's not like this young prostitute lady, but Grandma Rehab sitting around the campfire. And one of the things I loved whenever I was little is my Nana, I would always ask her, Nana, can you sing that one song? She would always sing to me. And the one song I always wanted her to sing was One More Valley. And I really like that song. It's an old Gaither song. And it was called One More Valley. And I imagine sitting around the campfire with Grandma Rehab and Boaz, Ruth, Jesus maybe be joining us with some fish. And we're all sitting there, and I imagine Boaz, or maybe Obed, Boaz's son, saying, Grandma, sing that one song. Sing that one song. And Ruth go, or Rehab go, I don't know. I don't know. That's really for just family time. No, we're all family. We're all family, Grandma. Sing that song. And she go, okay. Well, if you want to. I just imagine her kind of like, snippy Grandma. Okay, I got you. I'll sing it. And I imagine her sitting there around the campfire and saying, I want to go down in history as another blood-bought, faithful member of your family. And if they all forget my name, oh, that's fine with me. I'm just living for the world to see nobody but Jesus. And I imagine Jesus cracking a smile at that moment, saying, yeah, that's my great, give a few greats grandmother right there with the pipes. But that's the thing, is that God makes us to where people only see Jesus. Once he takes our scarlet letter and transforms us into a redeemed image bearer, we become a blood-bought, faithful member of his family. We become someone who no longer holds the title that we were so embarrassed of. Because what happened when Jesus came is that on the cross, he took every single scarlet letter that we have, and he shed his blood on the cross, that nothing but the blood of Jesus can wash away those things. But he did it, and he did it with you and with me in mind. He did it with his ancestors and his family tree in mind, thinking that there is a thread that runs so true throughout history. And it's going to continue flowing from me to all of the blood-bought members of my family. And that is you and that is me. If we choose to follow Jesus, if we choose to give our lives to Christ and be faithful to him. And Rehab in Matthew chapter 1, it says this. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah, his brothers, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Aminadab. Aminadab, I wonder if he dabbed. Just kidding. Aminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. I don't know if it's Atlantic or Pacific, but I like fish. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rehab. Not Rahab the prostitute. Rehab the righteous. Just Rehab. And I want to sit around the campfire someday with Rehab the righteous. You may say, well, the Bible says none is righteous, no, not one, but it also says that he became sin who knew no sin, so that we may become the righteousness of God. And today, you can trade your scarlet letter for becoming a redeemed image bearer of Christ.